Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron is up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
Yeah, I brought a film called Stamped from the Beginning, which was directed by Roger Ross Williams, and it's based on the book of same name by Ibram X. Kendi. And this was really powerful.
Yes.
It's centered around interviews of Black scholars and activists, such as Angela Davis, Brittany Cooper, Elizabeth Hinton, Dorothy Roberts, Carol Anderson, Imani Perry, and a whole lot more. Black women scholars, I should specify.
Yes.
And as they walk through some of the anti-Black myths that white supremacy has created and perpetuates, they tell a tale of the history of the United States. And I tried to catch them all here, but I don't know if I did or not.
Okay.
But it focuses on the myth of assimilation, Black hypersexuality, white savior, Black criminal, and it closes with a section called The Truth of the Anti-Racist Society, where the people being interviewed offer visions of what liberation looks like or what an anti-racist society might look like. And within these themes, there were stories about Phyllis Wheatley, slavery abolitionists, Ida B. Wells, and a lot more. The film is very moving and informative, and there's a ton of archival pictures and footage, both recent and not so recent. I don't want to say old because it's not that old. And it weaves together the history of racism in the U.S. really well to create a cohesive narrative, to tell this cohesive narrative about how all these different elements of white supremacy work together.
Yes.
To create aspects of anti-Blackness.
Absolutely. Yeah. What did you say there? Moving, informative, powerful. Like,
I did say those things, yeah.
Absolutely a great way to describe this film. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a great deal from watching this film.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage everyone listening to watch it. There was so much in the way of incredible history and I think unflinching truth presented in this film that I truly think should make it required viewing for all of us. And certainly the book that it's based off of should be required reading for all of us as well. I also admit that there were moments throughout this film where I found myself angry as hell.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some of that will come out here, but I'm not surprised by that. And I wasn't surprised by it going in, just sort of given the content of the film, but the imagery and the footage and the stories and the anecdotes and just the overall complexity of the history of this country and the history and present day conditions of Black people's experiences in this country that, you know, were presented so well in this film was and is just infuriating in a lot of ways. And so to me, there's a lot wrapped up when I say I really enjoyed this film. There's a lot wrapped up in that statement. Yeah. I enjoyed it, but it got me at times.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't choose enjoy to describe how I experienced this film because I don't think it's a great film and it's really well made.
Yes.
But it's hard to
hard.
watch, and
It's
there's
hard.
a lot of violence depicted.
Yes,
throughout.
absolutely.
So yeah, I feel you there.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is sort of, I think, a key takeaway from this film that was so powerful to me. It was shared by a woman named Honoré Fanoni Jeffers, who is an author, a poet, and a professor featured in this film. And I'm so glad you shouted out the fact that everyone in this film was a Black woman, everyone who spoke outside of Dr. Kendi.
Yep.
She said this, quote, "When we think about white supremacy, when we think about racism, when you pull back the curtain, you see the filth. There is a myth about the founding of this country. People want to erase American history as it truly was. White supremacy has been embedded in this country since its founding." And so to me, that myth is everything. That myth is a huge reason why we don't have equality and freedom for everyone in this country. And I think this film and certainly the book it's based off of is trying to get us to reckon with and let go of that myth. And to me, there's no doubt that we must do that.
Yeah, and I think what you just said reminded me of another moment in the film where I think it was Angela Davis talking about abolition of enslavement and that there was no there was no change in how society was organized, really.
Yes.
And in a lot of ways, whiteness and white supremacy was doubled down on. It was reified in many ways. And you pull back that curtain and you find the filth.
Yeah, it's all there.
Speaking of filth, the story of what happened to Phyllis Wheatley really stuck out to me in this film.
Oh, yeah.
I was vaguely aware of Phyllis Wheatley, but didn't know much about this story. I'm actually reading 400 Souls simultaneously, I guess, and this week I read the story of Phyllis Wheatley in that book.
Wow.
So it's good overlap
Yeah.
between a couple of things I'm working on. But Phyllis Wheatley was the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in the United States, which was shocking to everyone at the time because poetry is considered a fine art that in this white supremacist frame that existed at the time and continues to today means that she could not possibly have written poetry. And because of this view, a group of white men decided to interview her to try to figure out if she had actually written the poetry. And she had. And the film explains how this set a precedent and an example of how Black women have to continue to prove their worth, and created the presumption that white men have the right to ask Black women to prove their worth. And so Honore Jeffers said, every Black woman has a Phyllis Wheatley moment. And this made me think about all the ways that I don't have to prove my worth in spaces. I can show up in a lot of different places and be taken at my word in a lot of ways. And I don't have to think much about whether I have to provide any credentials in those spaces. And typically I'm thinking about work and showing up to spaces where there is some assumed credentials already, but still the way that you see it operate with people and who gets asked more questions about what it is they want to do and new ideas they have lands differently for different people.
Yeah.
And particularly Black women. And I've seen that play out everywhere I've worked, I think, as I reflect on it.
Well, and it's great that you've recognized it, right?
Yeah.
And can call it out and when you see it. And in my position as a Black man, I've seen that. I've seen it happen too, and your status, you walking into a room and talking is never questioned, ever. It's never been, until now, I should say until now, things have changed for the better in a lot of ways, but
a few ways
back in the day,
small ways.
It just, that's how it was. And that's how it was for lots of Black women. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the story of Phyllis Wheatley. Her story is so powerful. There's a lot to learn from it. And thank goodness that those white men did their investigative work to verify that she actually wrote that poetry. Was, again, infuriated. Infuriated. So that was a great story and connection to an analysis of what Black women in this film or in this country experience. And that was a part of the film that was so powerful too, to watch them. You said they all had this Phyllis Wheatley moment, and you can see on their faces them thinking about their own moment and moments, I should say, in their lifetime. It was moving to me.
And that was what we saw as the statement, every Black woman has a Phyllis Wheatley moment, was said. And so you see that analysis or that statement sort of land for all of these women who are being interviewed for the film. And it was really powerful and brought home that perspective and that understanding of how important that moment was in history and how it continues to ripple and reverberate into today.
Absolutely. One of the things I wanted to mention actually came at the tail end of Phyllis's story, the section of this film called The Myth of Assimilation. And this section was an exploration of how throughout history, white supremacy has demanded this notion of keeping white people safe at all costs and keeping white people feeling safe. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Having white people be safe and having them feel safe in every aspect of their lives. And in order to do that, Black people have been asked and told, and in some instances, I think, forced to assimilate to ways of being, ways of living that center white people's safety. And so one of the quotes I pulled, Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson is one of the scholars and authors featured in this film. She said, quote, "Assimilationist ideas are problematic because it compels you to sort of shapeshift into something that white people can approve of, that white people won't feel threatened by, that white people can sort of feel safe in." And I paused the film many times. This was one of those times. I appreciated her analysis here. I appreciated how this section of the film showcased how that has been such a pervasive part of our society, our experiences throughout history, but certainly in our present day, right? In our present day politics, in our present day media.
Yeah.
There's a part of the film that there's lots of, as you mentioned, footage and images and archival stuff that's shown throughout the film. And one of the things we see in this section is an advertisement from the skincare company Nivea. And another moment where I paused it because it's a photo, the advertisement is a photo of a well-dressed black man. And it features two slogans. One is re-civilize yourself, and one is look like you give a damn. Mm-hmm. And I just, like, everything in me was firing. I don't remember seeing that ad whenever it came out, but I can't. That's our experience, right? Like being told how to dress, how to act, how to be, to again make white people feel safe. And it's such that whole section just shows us how it's just, again, a pervasive part of our everyday lives. And so that section to me was so powerful. All of the analysis in it was incredible. And again, it made me so angry. And the way that you talked about Phyllis's story and the ways in which you reflected on it, there were lots of moments in this film, like with this Nivea ad, that I'm like, wow, yeah. That's how we've been talked to. That's how we've been told to be. And it's infuriating.
Yeah, all the rules.
Yes.
And frequently we talk about them as if they are subtle and they're quiet. Mm-hmm. And you see it in conversations like this film, and you see this ad and it's loud.
Yes.
All of a sudden it's loud, and the civilize yourself is just so obvious.
Right.
When maybe it looked like a print ad, and it was probably in the midst of a magazine, and you're flipping through the magazine and you're like, re-civilize yourself.
Yeah.
Like,
keep going, keep flipping, going. But and what?
Yeah, and so you take that moment and they highlight that and a few other ads from that company, and they're alongside older ads from the 30s or 40s or maybe even earlier, and they are also skincare companies, but they're skin lightening treatments, and with similar messages. Mm-hmm. And so that also puts everything into stark contrast of like these rules of how to assimilate, how to be civilized.
Yes. What is acceptable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All is laid bare in the film in so many ways.
Yes.
So speaking of the line re-civilize yourself, one of the other things that the film explored was the myth of the black criminal.
Yes.
Which explained why and how white power structures need to control and contain black people. And Dr. Raquel Gates said, quote, racist ideas take root if they can connect with something personal, with something emotional. By connecting that idea of protecting the women in your community to this alleged threat of blackness, you transform racist violence into virtue. And when you do that, it justifies all kinds of horrific actions. And so you take this myth of black criminality, and the way it connects emotionally is the protection of whiteness. Yes. And it connects back to what you said earlier of feeling safe.
Yes.
So it's not about whether or not you are safe. It's whether or not you feel safe. Mm-hmm. And when you believe this myth of the black criminal, the feeling of safety is no longer present.
Right.
And so then you have to connect. It connects to this emotion of needing to protect the people around you, especially when you hook into patriarchy and the way that white men in particular are told and taught about protecting the family, the community, whatever it is. And that's also connected to this white supremacy of the myth of the black criminal.
Right.
So all of this leads then to decades of racial terrorism visited upon black communities through the Klan and lynchings. And then this protection becomes codified to reinforce the myth of the black criminal.
Right.
And so it leads to segregation and black codes and mass incarceration, Reagan's myth of the welfare queen, Hillary Clinton calling kids super predators, the 94 crime bill, and on and on and on up until today. And we see it played out. There's the 911 call that was made before Trayvon Martin was murdered, is played in the film. Eric Garner is shown in the film. All of these people who have been killed because of this myth, not everybody, but a lot of
Yes.
examples of people who have been killed because of this myth are displayed in the film and connected to this idea of emotional protection and this feeling of threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, all that begins right here with the myth of the black criminal who is inherently violent and coming to get white people.
Right. And you see, you're right. You see how the myth built, how it snowballs, and the ways in which it continues today. You talked about, that sort of racial terrorism, that violence being inflicted on Black people today at the hands of the police. And even with proposals like Cop City, like we've talked about here,
Yep.
like all of that is tied to and connected to the myth of the black criminal. So that was a huge part of this film. That was incredible to learn more about. All of the violence in this film, I think, connects back to the invention of slavery and the invention of whiteness. So that was actually how the film started, I believe, opening. So before we got to the myths, the first two sections of the film were the invention of slavery and the invention of whiteness.
Yeah.
And those two parts for me really laid some great foundational context for, I think, everything we've talked about today, but also everything that's featured in the film. The enslavement of Black Africans was invented and justified year after year after year.
Yep.
And the notion of whiteness, as we know it, was invented when white indentured servants from Europe were separated out by their white slave owners and their white landowners. And those servants were given opportunities to break free from their servitude and begin to make something of themselves and their lives. They were given literal opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
So those parts to me were powerful, and I wanted to just name them and mention them because, again, I think they laid this foundation for everything. And there's some great history presented in both of those sections and there's some things I learned in those sections that was great, particularly the history of indentured servants from Europe and their experience and what they went through. But those sections to me were so powerful in showing us how all of these myths were invented and baked into the very beginnings of this country. And that to me is why it's been so hard to break free from all of this, or why it's been so difficult for us to break free from all of it.
Yeah, and it's that creation, that invention of whiteness going hand in hand with the invention of enslavement, particularly the version of slavery that we had in the United States was unique in history in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And yeah, you see that they set up examples of the powerful white elite were afraid of white indentured servants working in solidarity with Black enslaved people. And they found ways to allow the indentured servants to lift themselves up out of poverty and out of their servitude, and eventually then also buy enslaved people.
Yeah, the same people they were standing shoulder to shoulder with. Absolutely.
And so thank you for bringing that, because it's a huge part of what continues today, and there's elements of people's worldviews that is still grounded in that history.
Yes.
So yeah. All right. Well, now that we're talking about how these things are all connected, we've been doing that the whole time, but let's talk about application.
Okay.
How can we apply this film to our conversation here to our day-to-day lives? This film tells us a clear history of racism in America that is founded on white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And it takes us from the beginning of this country and how the patterns and systems were set up and then continue to today. It gives us all a set of myths to consider, the invention of systems, the invention of ideas and identities, and how they may operate in our own lives, in our own little corners of the world. And these are all typically myths that operate on a cultural level, where they're part of the air that we breathe, and they operate in us individually too, because we absorb them.
Yeah.
We take them in without noticing it. It's the quiet messages that are all over that when we talk about them, they become very loud. we can think about how we're participating in these things when we think about them and when we analyze them in a way like this film does. And we can think about how we were taught about these things or how we took them in and how they're influencing our communities or our workplaces or family, what have you. And there are patterns that were laid down hundreds of years ago that we've never collectively found our ways out of.
Yeah.
And they evolve and they morph with us as things change on the surface, but they don't change underneath. And so there's all of this energy underneath the surface of the water that's still rippling from the impact of these things that were established hundreds of years ago, that we haven't taken the time to figure out what's going on underneath the surface. We're just looking at the top of it all.
You just said they're part of the air that we breathe.
Yeah.
I mean, that right there, that's it. That's the quote. Pull that out. You're absolutely right. That's spot on application, everything you just said. So I'll co-sign it. I think the only thing I can do is build upon it, if you'll allow me,
Yes,
because
please do.
it was great. You know, to me, this film reminds us of the importance of understanding the true and unvarnished history of this country and the ways in which that history has influenced literally everything that we have experienced all the way to our present day. And you said that more brilliantly than I did. This film to me reminds us that this country was built on the myth of these values of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and it has been an arduous battle to break down and break free from those myths in every aspect of our society, in our systems, our social structures, our interactions with each other, our mindsets, our media, like I talked about earlier, our pop culture, as you said, our workplaces, our schools, our politics. So everything, as you said, the air that we breathe. And so to me, the application is understanding that, educating ourselves about that, learning from this history, and then doing something about it in every way that we can, in every place that we find ourselves, every sphere of influence that we have, every person in our lives. Like, we have to do something about that. We have to figure out a way to, as you said, breathe different air. Yeah. We have to.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yeah, we have to find a treatment for it. Or so, there has to be a way that we address it, and we haven't.
Yes.
All right, thank you for continuing to build on what I said. Let's talk about homework. How are we going to continue to learn about this beyond our conversation today? Amani Perry is one of the scholars who was interviewed here. She wrote a book a few years ago now called South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, in which she travels across the South to visit with people and talk about the history of these places and how deeply embedded racism is in the history of the United States, the history of the South, and what all of that means into today.
Wow. There's so many incredible women featured in this film, and the work that they've done is outstanding. And I mean, we could fill this room with everything that these folks have produced. And so I love that homework. It's yet another book I guess we have to add to our list. And I'm jazzed about that. I also want to, speaking of filling this room with that work, like, I would love to sit down and look at all of the body of work that these folks have produced and to figure out what more we can learn from all of that. I'd also love to read some of the historical texts and writings that were featured in this film. And so you talked about Phyllis Wheatley and her poetry, and I'm not familiar. I have not read any of Phyllis Wheatley's poetry, but the one poem, I think it was one poem, just a long one, that was featured in the film. Someone was reading it. It was beautiful. Yeah. It was absolutely beautiful. And so I would love to get my hands on that and read that and learn from, her experience and her analysis of what was happening at the time. Yeah. So I think there's lots to read and consume just based off of the incredible scholars featured in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. Her poetry, in the 400 Souls book, the person who writes about it, whose name I cannot recall, Alexis Pauline Combs, I think.
Okay.
My apologies if that's not quite right, but she likened Phyllis Wheatley to the first author in the United States who was doing speculative work.
Wow.
With her poetry. And I thought that was so powerful in the way that she analyzed what Phyllis Wheatley was writing about and the way that she used language to turn the way that her relationship was to the family that she was forced to work for. Like all of that is embedded in that 3 to 5 pages in that book too.
Wow.
So that could be a short little thing that you check out too.
Absolutely.
But some of her poetry is online as well. So
Yes.
you can find some of her work online.
Very good.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a great conversation for today. Stamped from the beginning. Check it out, folks. And Damien, you're up next time. So what do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Yes. All right. So for our next episode, I am so excited to bring our February book to the table for us to talk about, which I just finished today. So, hey, I'm with it. The book is called The Nation on No Map: Black Anarchism and Abolition. And it was written by William C. Anderson, who we read another great book of his already. He co-wrote As Black as Resistance, which is a book we read last year, and it was phenomenal. So I'm so excited to get to talk about another of his books, The Nation on No Map. So I pulled the part of the description of the book from AK Press's website. AK Press is the producer of this book. Quote, The Nation on No Map examines state power, abolition, and ideological tensions within the struggle for Black liberation while centering the politics of Black autonomy and self-determination. Amid renewed interest in Black anarchism among the left, Anderson offers a principled rejection of reformism, nation-building, and citizenship in the ongoing fight against capitalism and white supremacism. As a viable alternative amidst worsening social conditions, he calls for the urgent prioritization of community-based growth, arguing that in order to overcome oppression, people must build capacity beyond the state. And there was more there. It was hard to cut. I mean, it's the description was brilliant. The book has been phenomenal. There's been a lot that I've learned from it, and that I've already been thinking about. What do I want to talk about here? What do I want to ask you about? So I'm very much so looking forward to our conversation about it.
Yeah, me too. I realized when we picked this book for February that I did read this last year.
Oh, wow.
In the wake of bringing my son home. And so I read it again and realized that I did not remember much. There are very clear memories I have of certain passages.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of it that I was like,
You had a lot going on at that
haze
moment.
of a new baby. And I quote unquote read this. But, so I'm glad I had an opportunity to read it again and talk about it next week with you right here.
Very good.
All right, so with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.